in just 5 days from now. More than 190 countries will gather to negotiate for one last time before the global plastic treaty is delivered. Today, we have gathered to release our most recent report on global plastic treaty negotiation country positions that provides a bird's eye view on the position of each and every country just ahead of the fifth INC. This report pretty much covers all the key elements of the negotiated text that was made available by the UNEP Secretariat after the fourth INC that happened in Ottawa, Canada, April this year. I'm Atin from CSE, and I'm your host today, along with my senior colleague Siddharth and all the other researchers from the Solid Waste Management and Circular Economy unit of CSE, who all did this extremely painstaking task of reviewing hundreds of inserts and submissions country by country to make this report possible. We are extremely privileged to have joined by a pool of amazing panelists who will reflect on the key observations and findings of the report. We shall introduce the speakers to all of you once we invite them to speak. Now, some housekeeping announcement. This webinar is structured in 4 different parts. To start with, I will request my Director General, Dr. Sunita Narayan, to speak about the expectation from the 5th INC, and then we'll release the report. I will then invite my colleague Siddharth to make a small presentation and take us through the key findings of the report. We shall then invite the panelists for their reflections and open up the floor for questions from all of you. So please keep posting your questions in the Q&A box so that it is easier for us to pick up. I will then request Dr. Sunita ji for her closing remarks. So without taking any further time, let me request Sunita ma'am to please address the participants. Ma'am, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Atin. And again, thank you very much for the work that you and your team have done to put together the positions and to map out country positions on what is going to be a very important negotiation as in Busan, as you said, in another 5 days. It's very clear for most of us who live in the world that the plastic has become a problem quite unexpectedly. When plastics were introduced, they were seen as this wonder substance, something that would make for convenience in our world, something that was so much another one of those wonder substances like DDT or CFCs, which or even carbon dioxide, which is not a wonder substance, but the fact is it is like plastic, a long life substance. And that was really what was the real benefit of plastics, the fact that these were durable substances, that they would provide convenience because they had a long life. And today they have literally become the sign and the symbol of the Anthropocene. They have become symbol of our inability to deal with the materials we create and to be able to manage not just the waste of these materials, but to actually be able to make sure that they don't end up polluting the planet and creating another health burden. And it's interesting for environmentalists like me and for many of my colleagues because, you know, the issue of waste we thought had gone away in our world or had gone away in most parts of the world which were developed, because they had managed to clean up their streets, they had managed to clean up their cities. And for us, the issue of waste was really only about a matter of time. It was as we would develop, as we would get richer, we would also clean up our cities and the litter problem would go away. And so it was only seen as a matter of time, a matter of development, and then a matter of management. But increasingly, as the problem came up in our faces, we realized that actually the problem of plastic has not gone away. It may not be as littering, it may not be there littering our streets, but it's there in our oceans. It's there in terms of the landfills. It's there in the air in terms of the microplastics, and it has a huge health impact. And this is where the conversation of plastics as a global issue began in 2022. It was out of the box in many ways, not seen as a domestic litter problem, not even seen from the lens only of the Basel Convention, which was all about transboundary waste management, not from the lens of the pick or the pop, which was about chemicals and chemicals that we needed to make sure that we could phase out. It was really a complex problem of materials that we have created for our own convenience, which is now becoming, as I said, this extremely, this sign of the Anthropocene, which tells us that we need to do something about it, and urgently. Now, why is Busan therefore so important? Busan is so important because in some senses, the world has to come together to agree on how we are going to deal with this problem and how we are going to deal with it, not just as a litter problem, but as a problem of materials. The material we generate, which comes from the same petrochemical industry, a material that needs to be understood in terms of how it gets created, because the way it gets created is also going to mean in terms of how its life cycle will be. Can we actually recycle it? Can we reuse it? What are the toxins that go into the chemicals that manufacture this product? And then, of course, how do we deal with the litter? How do you deal with the waste? How do you manage this better than the current schemes of EPR or everything else? And how do we do all this by making sure that we can come together as nations? And I think this is really, in some senses, going to be the test of the times. We know today that we are in a very, very fractured world. We know today that we are in a polarized world. We know also the distrust between the developed and the developing countries is huge. But plastics is an issue that has broken through the normal lines of the North versus the South. Plastics is an issue which has created new groupings of countries which are looking to find solutions and countries which are concerned that those solutions would have an impact on their economic growth. Also countries that are concerned that the solutions may be half-baked. And I say this with some amount of, some amount of concern that Busan will have to rise above many of these issues, because we also know that in many times, and over the last many years, we've seen international negotiations which have phased out substances, phased out chemicals, introduced new chemicals which have new life, new vested interests, new economic interest enjoined with them, all to have them phased out again. And I talk about the classic case of DDT being replaced by organophosphates, then then other pesticides. And in each one, the developing countries have always wondered whether this phase out of chemicals, as we keep learning more, is something which is driven from science or really driven from the economic interests that get created in the business of making new chemicals. And the worst case of this has really been the CFC battle, where the companies which were responsible for creating the ozone hole actually benefited from making new wonder chemicals which they were paid for to substitute the old. Now, all this means that Busan will have to find a way to bridge this conversation, to create the trust again so that we can come together on one table and agree that this issue of plastic, the plastic treaty, is important for us, and that for once the world is going to rise above these petty economic interests to find ways in which we can indeed find a treaty which deals with the need to minimize the creation of that material, work on the substance of that material so that it is not so toxic, and then, of course, create the right conditions to manage it so that we can recycle and reuse and make sure that we do not have the litter either on our lands or in our seas, and certainly not in our bodies. So that's really the conversation that my colleagues have been working on, and we're delighted that we have today three very wonderful panelists who are going to help to steer us and help to tell us how this conversation will unfold, must unfold, and what must we make sure that we get out of Busan. So thank you very much, Atin, again, for asking me to give these opening remarks, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Very insightful and very specific regarding what should we expect and what should feature in the final treaty. So let us now do the formality of releasing the report. I request all my colleagues who have a physical copy of this report to just show the report on camera. And I will also request my colleagues to share the link of the report in the chat box so that people can download it and see it for themselves. So thank you so much. So the report is now released. And let me now give the floor to my colleague Siddharth, who has played a very instrumental role in getting this report done with the help of the rest of the team. So Siddharth, I request you to make a quick presentation and take us through the key findings and observations from the report. The floor is now yours, and let me help you by sharing my screen and showing your presentation. Just give me a second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Atin. And thank you, ma'am, for that opening remarks. So, I will be taking you through the report itself and also around what the issues currently are as they're being discussed in the treaty, and what kind of scientific evidences do we have. Okay. So the first question actually is that where do plastics actually come from? So today, as we know, about 99% of all the plastics that we use are derived from the crude oil and gas industry. They make their way to the petrochemical plants where they are converted into polymers, and we use them in our daily lives. So this is kind of an oversimplified schematic, which basically talks about how plastics is given various forms uh, through unit operations, mostly chemical reactions. So as you can see, the crude oil and gas industry is the kind of the source of all the plastics or polymers that we deal with. Originally, all the naphtha that was kind of a byproduct of the crude oil and gas industry was used to make plastics. But today, with all the technological advancements that we have, crude oil and natural gas itself can be used pretty much to make plastics and polymers that we use. So essentially, what we are doing while we make plastics is converting very large molecular hydrocarbon chains and converting them into smaller molecules. And these molecules are specifically, with the use of catalysts, cut into or cracked into a 2-carbon hydrocarbon chain, 3-carbon, 4-carbon, or a 6-carbon hydrocarbon chain, which is then saturated by breaking and making bonds, through which we get the monomers. And then these monomers actually go through a process which is called as polymerization. through which we get all the plastics that we deal with. So as you can see, the 2-carbon hydrocarbon chain and the 3-carbon hydrocarbon chain that we're talking about, these are primarily olefins that we're talking about, and these make up about 2/3 of all the plastics that we consume in our daily lives. And as you can also see, everything from carry bags to water pipes to the clothes that we wear are derived from these two monomers of ethene and propene. Now, this is how it is made, but there's also one very important aspect that we have to understand is that at the step of polymerization, there are several chemicals or additives that go into making a particular plastic and giving it certain physical and chemical properties. For instance, a low density polyethylene can be used to make a milk pouch, but at the same time, it can also be used to make a rigid plastic. Plastics that may be transparent, blue, black, white, it can have various colors. All of these physical properties are a result of the additives that we are adding. These additives may be flame retardants, they may be plasticizers, they may be stabilizers, and all of these are nothing but groups of chemicals. These groups of chemicals have certain environmental as well as human health impacts, some of which are very widely studied, like the bisphenol A, some of which are not disclosed at all, which means that they are present in our products, plastic products that we use, but we are not aware of their chemical composition. We do not have a material safety data sheet for them, which means that we don't know how they will react at high temperatures. We don't know how they will react when they come in contact with water or any other environmental factors. Now, like we said, naturally, because plastics do come from the oil and gas industry, a lot is at stake for both companies as well as countries or member states that are producing or or have reserves of oil and gas, right? So as we see on in these two donuts, about 1/3 of all the global oil production happens in North America. These are figures from 2022. About 13% happens just in Saudi Arabia. And these crude oils are then transported to several different parts of the world. So as you can see on the right donut, about almost about half of all the plastic that is globally produced is produced in Asia, with China alone producing about 1/3 of all the primary plastic polymers. Right. So there are two sets of countries that we're talking about. One is the oil and gas rich countries, and the other one is that takes these raw materials from oil rich countries, gas rich countries, and utilizes them and converts them into plastics, and we use them in various formats. This is a part of the report. Basically, this is a list of about 36, 38 countries that are surplus in oil. To be specific, surplus in total petroleum and other liquids. And as you can see, countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, these are all surplus. So about 8,500 million barrels per day. That is the surplus that these countries have. And they want these products to be taken away for obvious reasons. Now, about the treaty, basically, this was the background. Now, about the treaty, I think, like ma'am mentioned in her opening remarks, this is not something that has happened overnight. It was a result of a process that has been through several rounds of reiteration, several rounds of negotiations, and it all started with UNIA in 2012. Now, United Nations Environment Assembly is a body where members meet every 2 years, and they decide and deliberate on the most important pressing environmental issues of our times. One such issue that was discussed and still is discussed at every UNIA meeting is plastics. Now, in the first meetings or in the first few meetings, plastics was primarily looked at as a marine litter issue. And then from there, we graduated to marine litter and microplastics. In fact, in 2018, there was a resolution that was tabled by India, where India was pushing for a global plastic treaty that is primarily focusing on single-use plastics. And a wonderful methodology has been developed in India, which has been actually the methodology in itself is criteria based. It actually takes into consideration utility index and environmental impact index of plastic products that are problematic, avoidable, and India is doing it at the national level. But similar criteria is also basically what India proposed in UNIA 4 was to have this discussion around single-use plastics. However, there were other proposals that were tabled, and finally, what we had in 2022 is Resolution 5/14, which mandated to look at this issue of plastic pollution across the life cycle. Right? And what also happened in 2022 was through the resolution, there was a mandate to establish a committee, which was the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. And this committee would be meeting and deliberating on all of these issues. Now, this committee has already met 4 times officially, and several issues were discussed. Now, if you look at this table, it says that the first potential options for elements paper, which was a 37-page document, it was supposed, I mean, how the process basically goes on is countries or member states would come together and streamline the text that was available, thus uh, eliminating options that don't see consensus and adopting provisions that everyone agrees on. But what we see here is between INC 2 and INC 4, the text that we see has almost doubled with as many as 3,000 brackets in the text itself. Now, between INC 4 and 5, a lot of things have happened, which right now we have a section in the report which talks about what has happened between INC 4 and 5. But one very important thing that has happened is the chair of this committee now has tabled a non-paper, which is prepared in consultation with all the member states. And this 17-page document is most likely to become the basis of negotiations in Busan. Now, what we have done in this report is we have primarily looked at 22 different provisions that were in the revised zero draft, and we have uh, tried to look at all the in-session submissions that are available on the portal and also map them in terms of what member states agree with the text as it is, what member states do not agree or do not want to see certain provisions, or whether they weaken or strengthen that particular provision. And these are the provisions that we've looked at in the report. Due to paucity of time, I will not be able to discuss all, but what we've done to kind of understand is bifurcate these provisions into areas of convergence and divergence. Now, what we saw is there is convergence mostly on the downstream part of this entire scheme of things. So there is, everyone agrees that, okay, we will have to do better waste management. We will have to adopt uh, a, a, a just transition mechanism or pathways. Then there are issues which member states are ready to discuss, but there is more deliberation that is needed on these issues. These are issues like chemicals and polymers of concern, problematic avoidable plastics, including single-use plastic, product design, financing. And then there are areas where countries or member states stand absolutely divided. And these areas are whether we should have production cuts, whether trade should, be featuring in the final text, and whether health aspects should be featuring in the text. Now, uh, these are how we've mapped them, and these are all on the basis of the in-session submissions. So while there is consensus around the provisions of plastic waste management, but what we also see that if you look at the nuances, so there are certain countries who do not want to follow the waste hierarchy, even if we are agreeing to plastic waste management, but we may, prioritize incineration based technologies over mechanical recycling, so on and so forth. So there are these nuances that exist. While there is consensus broadly, but if you look at the nitty-gritties, there are still disagreements on what kind of text should actually feature. Just transition pathways, like you see, pretty much all the countries are in favor of this. Although, how we implement these pathways are something, again, the nitty-gritties might have disagreements. Now, these are all issues where there is more deliberation needed. So, chemicals, polymers of concern, there are uh, uh, some member states who mention that we do not want to see polymers featuring along with the word concerns, because polymers are not concerns, polymers are wonder materials. There are some certain member states that say that chemicals are already being regulated in other multilateral environmental agreements, and this is not the space to discuss them. Uh, and so on and so forth. So there are various issues, but this is something that member states are open to discuss at this point of time. Then there is the issue of problematic plastics, avoidable plastics. Again, there is uh, uh, member states are open to discuss this, but broadly the disagreement is whether these should be done at a national level according to national capacities, capabilities, and according to national laws, or whether we should actually have a global set of rules which will decide a criteria based on which we can actually establish plastic products and plastics to be problematic, avoidable, unnecessary, etc. Then there's the issue of product design and performance, which is also featuring in the chair's non-paper, where the whole idea is if we start to design plastic products better, we may actually, move out of this crisis. Uh, and obviously we have financing mechanisms, resources, where again the divide between rich countries and developing countries is pretty evident, especially in this particular provision, where certain countries are demanding for a dedicated fund. In fact, one of the African countries has also proposed a global plastic pollution fee, which has become and will be discussed at the upcoming negotiations in Busan.
Siddharth, you need to wrap up.
Yeah. And yeah, these are areas where absolutely some countries are hell-bent on saying that we absolutely do not want to see this. And then there is a group of about 40 countries who has signed on a declaration which is called the Bridge to Busan, and they are strongly advocating for language around this provision. And then we also have health aspects which were added probably uh, uh, for the first time in the INC4 negotiations. Now, a lot has happened between INC 4 and 5. For starters, there was intersessional work which was mandated by the fourth meeting, and there were two expert groups that met, and they have their report which will be presented to the committee in INC 5, and it will be used to inform the decisions and the language that will go into the text. We have the chair's non-paper, which is it has faced a lot of criticism from a lot of people, including civil society organizations across the globe. And then we have the ministerial statement starting to flow right before we get into the negotiations in Busan. We have Georgia, Ghana, Ethiopia, Switzerland. They have focused on the concept of One Health, where they're saying that health has to be at the center of this negotiations. There is a G20 ministerial statement that came out, I think, a couple of days back, if I'm not wrong. And then there's also the High Ambition Coalition members' joint statement, which is trying to align itself with the chair's non-paper. And what we can expect from INC5, I'm sure there are other speakers who will also talk about it, but there is, in all likelihood, the chair's non-paper will be the basis of negotiations. There will be possibility of delay due to election of bureau members, or potential discussion on how will decisions be made, because this is something that the committee has failed to kind of agree upon. There will be lots of conference room papers and informal meetings, and uh, I don't want to say this, but there is a high probability that compromises will be made both from the high ambition and the like-minded countries. So that's it from my side, and I will now hand it back to Atin.
Thank you, Siddharth. It was very insightful and very specific. It's time to invite the first speaker for the day. So we have with us Dr. Julius Piercy from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Government of United Kingdom. Let me quickly introduce Dr. Julius before I invite him to speak. Dr. Julius is the lead negotiator on Plastic Pollution Treaty for the United Kingdom. With a background as a scientist and marine biologist, Dr. Julius has been involved in the plastic pollution internationally since 2018, including the historical decision in 2022 to begin negotiation on a new treaty. So on this note, thank you so much, Dr. Julius. I would like to request you to reflect on the criteria-based approach for problematic and avoidable plastic, including short-lived and single-use plastics, which you had discussed in the last meeting. So my question is, are you going to push the proposal of your government made in the last meeting, even this time in the fifth INC? I request you to just cover this aspect in your interventions, if you could. Thank you so much. The floor is now yours.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Atin, and thank you, of course, to Siddharth and CSE more broadly for inviting me to speak today. I do have a very short presentation, so I'll try and share my screen if that's possible. Let's hope this all goes to plan. I won't be able to see anyone once I share, so can you just confirm as well with me that you can see it once I've managed to share?
Yes, we can see it, Dr. Julius. If you could just make it full screen. Yeah, you're good. Please
Great,
go ahead.
thank you very much. As you know, I think the introduction says it all. I mean, I have been involved now for quite some time in the negotiations, too long, some would say, but it has been really interesting and fascinating to see this from the very start, and the conversations as well that happened before the UNEA resolution 514 that really gave rise to this. It wasn't the first time that there was an attempt to introduce a decision to start negotiations on the global treaty. That actually happened 3 years before. It wasn't successful though, but at the second attempt, very exciting to say it got through in the end. And it forms quite a good basis for the negotiations that are going forwards. I should also mention that the treaty negotiation process is usually very long. Some might say 2.5 years is long as well, but it is very much a sprint to the finish line by treaty standards. So I will. I'm just going to touch on one specific aspect, that's the problematic and avoidable plastic products. And I know you've already given an introduction, Siddharth, on sort of the long range of things that are going to be discussed. And I know that Amy, after me, will be presenting a little bit more on the overview of the chair's non-paper. But the reason why I'm picking this up is because it's, you know, it really is a central provision within the treaty. It covers, I think, probably the most obvious things that we're trying to see when we see plastic pollution. It's how do you make sure that you are removing those items that are currently polluting the environment or causing harm to human health. And it has, though, a long history behind it. So actually, it was as far back as INC2, which was in May 23 in France. There was a discussion around trying to get some intersessional work off the ground on problematic plastic products and chemicals of concern as well. But there wasn't any success in that. I think the countries were still not prepared to go into the detail. There were lots of other substantive issues that they wanted to resolve. But we certainly recognized we needed to start a process to go into the detail, because just covering it at a high level was not sufficient. We really needed to understand what we were talking about. So we called for intersessional work formally at INC4. We weren't successful. We made a statement to say we'll try and do it in an informal manner. And I'm pleased that we then, UK and Brazil, then launched an open-ended technical dialogue on problematic and avoidable plastic products, particularly around the criteria and some lists as well for what products would be included at the stage. And that invited technical experts nominated by countries from all around the world. I think we had around 50 countries represented. And we came up with a really quite a good long list of different criteria that could address either whether an item or product was problematic or whether an item was avoidable. So we then went to INC3 with this idea in hand that we've started that conversation. Lots of countries were keen as well to begin the formal process of intersessional work. We ended up, I think, in the very last hours of the negotiations at something like 3 o'clock in the morning, we were still discussing this. And unfortunately, again, we weren't able to get the mandate to start the informal work. So again, with Brazil, we continued the process on these informal dialogues, this time to try and refine the criteria from this long list of different criteria that we had, to try and narrow it down, see what countries' preferences were and where the greatest level of support was lying for the different criteria. Fast forward to INC4 in Canada. This is where the UK and Thailand actually put forward a text proposal based on the outcome of the informal dialogues that we'd been having. And so it's called a conference room paper. We shared it with many countries. It's made its way into the main text, and this time, finally, we were successful in getting a mandate for formal intersessional work. And that brought us all to having discussions in Bangkok, which covered problematic and avoidable plastic products, as well as other things like chemicals of concern or means of implementation. So there are a variety of things discussed in that formal intersessional work. But that means there's also been a lot of additional work, a lot of feedback we've had on the proposal that the UK and Thailand presented in Canada. And so it's something we're now working on still. Only a few more days left now. We're flying out to Busan tomorrow. So it's right up to the wire, but we're trying to incorporate as much feedback as possible that we've heard from countries to see what we can to hopefully get to an agreement on at INC5. So I'll just give a little bit of an overview of what the actual proposal said at INC4. It was quite simple in its view, or at least we thought it was quite simple. Not everyone agreed. But where you had essentially 2 stages of different criteria that would be used. First, to identify whether an item was problematic, and then to determine whether that item was also avoidable or not. And so criteria around whether something was problematic tends to focus on the likelihood of harm to the environment or to human health, or the likelihood of ending up into the environment, and then finally on whether a product disrupts circularity. These could be single-use products, or they could be items that disrupt the recycling system because they contaminate it with polymers or things that can't be recycled or easily differentiated from the rest of the products. So the next, so if an item was problematic, then you'd go and look at whether it was avoidable. And here the criteria, I think, for avoidability is something particularly difficult to get onto. The idea of whether that item is essential or not is a key one. And then the second is sort of what can it be easily redesigned, or are there substitutes already in existence and widely used that could fulfill the same function of that product. So if the answer is yes, that it is avoidable, there are readily available substitutions, or it can be redesigned in a way that makes sure that it's reused rather than simply used and disposed of. Then it could be put on a list for items to be phased out globally. If it was not avoidable, then the idea would be, let's continue to try and redesign it so that it stops being a problematic product. Behind all of this, obviously, there's a lot of technical work and there's a lot of considerations that need to be made about the different uses and making sure that there aren't any unintended substitutions, for example, things that create a greater problem than the original product. And so the idea was to have an expert body or a scientific and technical committee that could include not just the science, but be a bit broader than that and have a look at bring in economists, bring in social scientists, and have a wide view of the kinds of things that factors that would need to be considered in any recommendation that was put forward on both whether to refine the criteria and change them, because we might not get everything right at the first time, so it's important to maintain a review mechanism to make sure that we've got those criteria right. And secondly, to work out whether certain products do fulfill the criteria that are listed and whether they should end up going onto one of these lists. So that was the general concept, and I can probably give you a quick example. For example, if we get something like plastic bags, are they problematic? Yes, they tend to be littered, they tend to end up in the environment, spread around quite easily, they're widely used. Are they avoidable? Now, it seems to be the case that many countries are now putting in place either bans or phase outs or other mechanisms to reduce single-use plastic bag use, because we have other things available out there and they're readily available as well. So we've now seen it's not a matter of whether, maybe in Europe some countries have done it and elsewhere it hasn't. This has been done now widely across the globe. As I think Sunita mentioned at the beginning, there is no split really in this in terms of a divide of global north or global south. There is action being taken everywhere on this. So plastic bags would be a good example of where you could then move to a global phase out of single-use plastic bags. Something else though on which might not be avoidable everywhere, it might be avoidable in some countries but not in others, is something like containers for water. So there are many different types of containers for water. In some countries, these will be single-use sachets that ensure that there's safe water to be used by everyone. It might be that in some countries, although this is a problematic product, in some countries at the moment it is unavoidable. So the idea would be to go and have a look at how it could be redesigned in a way to make sure that we're not ending up with lots of sachets of water being thrown away, but still maintaining that really important part of water safety. I think I'll move on to sort of where we are now. Essentially, we've been listening to lots of countries' feedback. We've had the intersessional work, and there are a few things that have come out of that. So whether problematic and avoidable plastic products was the route we went down. There are quite a few comments on avoidability. Many countries feel this is not clear enough, or that the essential use criteria is too dependent on national context to be able to look at this from a global perspective. So we're increasingly talking about problematic products as a whole and less about the avoidability now, and that's something we've been hearing to date. Another thing we've been hearing is that criteria are too detailed. So what I presented was just a sort of summary of some of the criteria, but we do have slightly more detailed criteria. But given the point at which we are now in the negotiations, it seems less likely that countries will be able to go into the detailed negotiations required for looking at that criteria in any detail. So there is potential to look at some high-level criteria to start with, and then mandate the Conference of the Party to review this and to develop more detailed criteria at a later stage. The other thing is many countries have said now that they need greater flexibility for their national context. That means both in the types of products that end up being regulated, but also the way in which they get regulated. So bans or tends to be quite a blunt instrument. And there are other things which can have similar effects or very significant effects on reducing or phasing out those items. Again, there are quite a few, an example of this is there are quite a few countries that instead of putting a ban on single-use plastic bags have put in a charge, and at least in the UK that has reduced single-use plastic bags, I think by over 99%. So it's had a significant effect on actually reducing the use of single-use plastic bags, even though these aren't actually banned. So where does this bring us, I guess, is we're now in the final stages of trying to refine that proposal that we put forward at INC4, consulting still with other countries. I have meetings straight after this with a few different delegations as well, just to try and hone in on what might be supported so that we turn that orange issue that was on the map presented by CSE on problematic and avoidable plastic products. So we turn that one into a green one, hopefully, and we'll get some agreement at INC5. I've put, so by INC5, I don't think is the end of the road. I think, as I've mentioned, there will still be a lot of more work to do to get more into the technical detail, to get more of the science involved in understanding how we're going to develop these criteria ahead of the first Conference of the Parties. So this, even if we get an agreement on this at INC5, the work is not over, and we'll need to carry on these consultations and considerations of getting the criteria and potentially that list of products that need to be regulated by the treaty in a global way. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julius. Let me now invite the next speaker. Dr. Julius, if you may just close your presentation. So our next speaker is Emmy Youngman from Environmental Investigation Agency based out of the United Kingdom. Let me quickly introduce Emmy before I invite her to speak. Emmy is an attorney and legal and policy specialist for the Environmental Investigation Agency in the United Kingdom. Emmy currently works on the Global Plastic Treaty and complementary international and regional plastic governance with a focus on production reduction, limiting pollution from high-emitting sectors and sources, and plastic waste trade. Emmy, thank you so much for your participation. We now have the third version of the chair's non-paper on the global and national voluntary and binding approaches and expectation from the last round of negotiation, which is pretty much going to be the foundation of the discussion in the 5th INC. What is your take? How do you see this unfolding? Over to you, Emmy.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you to CSE for having me today. And congratulations on the launch of your report. I think it's really useful to understand country positions, which have evolved a lot over the last 2 years, but is also important now because we have, in addition to the compilation checks, the chair's non-paper. And so it's really useful to see how countries were talking about the provisions before they were consolidated. So CSE, again, has asked me to reflect on the chair's non-paper, and I'd like to provide some additional context about why we're working with this document and what it means for the process. So let me start by reflecting on where we are in the timeline and the significance of this text. As you can see on this slide, we're approaching the 5th and possibly final round of negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty. I think that the expectations are high as countries aim to finalize an agreement that can end plastic pollution and address harms across the entire life cycle of plastics. This is an ambitious generational effort with no simple solutions, and INC5 will be critical in resolving major disagreements and demonstrating whether we have the political will and ambition to deliver a strong treaty by the deadline, which is at the end of this year. So this timeline was really deliberate. We intentionally chose it, knowing that there were going to be important elections that could shift political will, but also I think that this timeline recognizes and sort of grounds us in the urgency of the crisis. A treaty that can take effect quickly is critical because every year of delay allows plastic pollution to exponentially escalate, causing further irreparable damage to human health and the environment. However, a treaty without sufficient ambition does risk entrenching weak measures that fail to address the crisis effectively, potentially doing more harm than good in the long term. So over the last 2 years, and like Julius mentioned even before, we've worked to create a foundation for this treaty, but at INC4, attempts to streamline the text resulted in that 77-page compilation text that Sada already mentioned, over 3,770 sets of brackets. And for those of you that aren't familiar with international law, brackets represent unagreed text, so points of disagreement or unresolved issues that require a negotiation to agree on before removing those brackets. So the sheer volume of text to be negotiated made it clear that using this text as the basis for further negotiations would exceed the 7 days of negotiating time available to us in Busan. So the question then becomes, what can we do between Ottawa and Busan to address this challenge and set ourselves up for success in Busan? And I think the EIA agreed with many others and that we needed to take a critical look at where we are and triage the treaty. So a triage is a medical term or a term used in disaster where you make difficult decisions. What is not worth keeping at this stage? What is critical to save and thus requires the most time and resources? What can we slap a Band-Aid on to keep it alive without wasting too much critical negotiating time on it? And so hearing this sort of discussion that many were having, this chair decided that he was going to use the intersessional period to see if he could triage the compilation text. So over the intersessional period, he released the 3 iterations of the non-paper. He met with the heads of delegations and with different regions and tried to gather views. And this culminated in that non-paper that we're referring to today, the 31 articles across the life cycle of plastics, going from 77 pages down to 18 pages. And it also includes necessary final provisions that had not yet been discussed. And this is a consolidation of areas of agreement among committee members. This non-paper aims to streamline the discussions by focusing on common ground while leaving room for resolving key contentious issues, which were identified as supply, which was formerly known as plastic production, finance, and then part of what Julius was just talking about, the third is plastic products and chemicals of concern as used in plastic products. So for those 3 articles, the chair did not propose text, but he provided text proposals on everything else. And then the question becomes, what do we do with this non-paper? And that's not a question that I can necessarily answer today with certainty, because again, this is a member state-driven process, so it's really up to the member states to decide. I have spoken to many delegations across regions, and I think what I'm hearing is that there's a greater understanding of the importance of this non-paper as a tool to move us forward. I think that there is agreement that we can use this as a basis for negotiations, but also hearing that countries that have throughout the process operated to delay and disrupt, they could take issue with this proposal. And so we really need the chair and other high ambition countries to be prepared for that conversation and to resolve it as quickly as possible so that we can establish some sort of basis for negotiations in Busan. Is the non-paper perfect? I genuinely do not think you can find a single person, let alone a delegation, that would deem it perfect text. There's a common saying in international negotiations that a good compromise is when everyone is unhappy. I think that this text reflects that. The chair's non-paper does, however, represent a strategic effort to break through the impasse in the global plastic treaty negotiations. It's a way to inject some clarity into this process and kind of overcome the bracketed text that was completely fragmented and, in my own personal view, was unworkable. I think that it prioritizes the right elements that would benefit from something that we have not had in the INC process, which is actual negotiations and discussion, so that we can understand member states' views, have an opportunity to create a fully operational treaty, acknowledging that some issues can be addressed in the future. And to use the non-paper effectively, I think that it's crucial to approach it as both a tool for consensus and a framework for ambition. So it's not a departure from the core principles developed over the past 2 years, but rather a streamlined version designed to build momentum and capitalize on political will. And countries should really focus on strengthening the provisions in the current draft and avoid diluting key measures. At the same time, negotiators must recognize the importance of maintaining balance, so ensuring that the treaty is ambitious enough to tackle the global plastics crisis effectively while being realistic and implementable. So the non-paper offers an opportunity to turn these years of effort into a tangible and impactful agreement, but success depends on the commitment of all stakeholders to prioritize solutions over stalling tactics and work collaboratively to finalize a treaty that can begin to address plastic pollution as swiftly as possible. That being said, there are really two main critiques I want to discuss today. To have any hopes of a successful outcome in Busan, we at EIA think it should be accepted with two very important caveats on horizontal issues or issues that cut across the entire life cycle. The first is the omissions. You can see, oh, sorry. I think I've messed up my slides, so there we go. So now you can see the omissions. This is a list of some of the things that were excluded from the non-paper. And I think that the report launched today is really useful, again, because it does map out, how are countries feeling about trade, fishing gear, extended producer responsibility. Some of these had broad support to date. And we at EIA think that the chair's non-paper should not prejudge or prejudice articles that were omitted. So for example, it's unclear to us why, despite substantial discussion and support, the chair's non-paper excludes reference to or even suggested text for an article on dedicated programs of work, one of the most important implementation measures in our point of view. And there was broad support for it in Canada. And although we spent a lot of time discussing which sectors should be prioritized, we could move forward with text and decide that at a later date. So EIA recommends negotiators submit simplified, streamlined text on and ensure time during sequencing for dedicated programs of work, but also extended producer responsibility, fishing gear, and reuse. So then the second horizontal issue is the nature of the legal obligation. And it's important to remember that treaties are binding international agreements that impose legal obligations on the treaties that sign and ratify them. So whether referred to as an agreement, an accord, convention, or protocol, the name does not change the fundamental nature of these instruments. They create commitments that countries are legally required to fulfill. And when a country becomes a party to a treaty, it undertakes a binding responsibility to adhere to its provisions, which govern how countries interact on the agreed subject matter. So this binding nature distinguishes treaties from other international instruments like declarations, which are not legally enforceable. Within, and apologies for the text-heavy slides here, but going to get into it a little bit. So within the framework of a treaty, the nature and scope of legal obligations can vary significantly. The specific language used in a treaty provision determines the extent of a country's duty. So for instance, when a treaty states that countries shall undertake an action, this indicates a mandatory requirement. Conversely, language such as encourage to or may implies a degree of flexibility, but does not necessarily remove the binding nature of the provision. So countries still have an obligation to engage with these provisions in good faith, even if the requirements are less prescriptive. The distinction between mandatory and non-mandatory provisions is often a key focus in treaty negotiations, including throughout the INC process, as countries are seeking to balance ambition with practical implementation, which is something that Julius just discussed. So to fulfill these obligations, a country must typically incorporate the treaty's provisions into its domestic legal system. This process, known as transposition, ensures that the treaty's requirements are enforceable within the country's jurisdiction. Even provisions that seem voluntary, such as those encouraging certain actions, carry a binding expectation that the country will consider it and act on them in the best of its ability. The treaty as a whole obliges countries to engage constructively with all its provisions, reflecting that principle that international agreements are entered into with the intent of compliance, which is very important to remember. Thus, while the exact obligations may vary in their strictness, the overarching commitment to the treaty remains binding on the country. However, within the chair's non-paper, while streamlining elements from the previous unwieldy text often prejudges the legal nature of those obligations. So it sets an unnecessarily low bar for ambition. And you can see an example here, the text on national plans. Each party may develop and implement a national plan, making these plans legally binding, but essentially voluntary obligations, which falls short even on the minimal ambition set out by the Paris Agreement. And this approach assumes weakened obligations such as encourage or acknowledge before negotiations have even begun, undermining the potential for comprehensive and binding measures needed to address the plastic pollution crisis. Similarly, you can see here that product design is encouraging promotion, which is not very strict. It doesn't set the necessary international overarching obligation necessary to have meaningful effect on how we create plastic products so that they are non-toxic and reusable and designed for recycling. So the chair also uses examples of a strong legal obligation that require parties to do things like stop emissions and releases of plastics and chemicals, or makes reporting mandatory. It is a bit frustrating that the reporting obligation is mandatory, but then because of national plans only having a may obligation, it's unclear what you would report on. But this is just further examples of how the chair kind of already prejudged what is going to be weak and what is going to be strong legal obligation to fulfill. And in addition to the legal obligation, the accompanying text also determines whether countries can choose their own obligations, like in the Paris Agreement, or whether the treaty takes a binding top-down approach as seen in the Montreal Protocol. And these reflect two fundamentally distinct strategies for addressing global challenges. The Paris Agreement adopts a bottom-up approach where countries set their own nationally determined contributions, tailoring commitments to their specific circumstances and capacities to achieve the global reduction target. While this approach fosters inclusivity and flexibility, it often results in uneven ambition and a lack of enforceable standards, relying heavily on transparency and peer pressure to drive progress. So here, even where there are obligations shall take measures too, there's no further obligation on what those measures should be, and we will rely heavily on parties' interpretations in achieving those obligations. In contrast, you have the Montreal Protocol, which employs a top-down approach with binding commitments and legally enforceable targets, such as phasing out ozone-depleting substances. This structure ensures a more uniform and ambitious global response backed by compliance mechanisms that hold countries accountable. At EIA, we think that in order to address this in the non-paper, the best approach to establish at the outset is to preserve divergent views by using brackets. I know that we don't like brackets, but here we think it's important. So it should read, each party, bracket text, shall, should, may, develop and implement national plans, for example, allowing negotiators to resolve the legal nature of the obligations during discussions to serve as a fair basis for negotiation. The non-paper should remain neutral and not presuppose voluntary measures where stronger commitments may be necessary. And then finally, what can we expect? Like all INCs before, it's impossible to say with certainty what is going to happen. However, we really hope that countries feel the pressure of needing to finalize this treaty. The majority of countries participating believe in this process and will need to put in the hours. I think, Julius, we have more 3 a.m. time or nights ahead of us. Really need to put in the hours to strengthen the chair's non-paper and ensure that it reflects enough ambition to be a sturdy foundational treaty that we can build out in future years. So even between the final INC and the first conference of the parties, we can continue to work towards progress so that we hit the ground running. And I agree with others that the threat of countries with low ambition disrupting the process remains, but consensus building must embrace both collaboration and decision-making mechanisms, including the possibility of voting to prevent stalling by the minority of countries. And the leave no country behind must not be used as a pretext to hold back global progress. Instead, it should drive the design of supportive measures that can enable countries to meet these commitments. So negotiators got to prioritize building a treaty framework that's ambitious, enforceable, and equipped to address the full life cycle of plastics. Delegates must also break down the silos between control measures and means of implementations, creating a cohesive, what we're calling Grand Busan Bargain, that ties binding upstream measures to financial and technical assistance, ensuring an equitable and impactful treaty. And we encourage the delegations to be bold and seize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to end plastic pollution. So again, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to seeing you all in Korea, and please reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. This was super insightful. Let me now bring in the next speaker, Andreas, and also quickly introduce him to all of you. Andreas Shea is Counselor for Climate and Environment at the Norwegian Embassy in New Delhi. His areas of responsibility at the embassy include climate and environmental policy, biodiversity and forests, circular economy and marine pollution, plastic pollution, and clean air. Previous to being posted in India, he has worked for over 15 years with international environmental cooperation, including on Norwegian Indian Biodiversity Project, as well as on the international negotiation, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Berne Convention, and the Polar Bear Agreement. Andreas, thank you for your participation today. My question to you is, what would be your expectation from the High Ambition Coalition to end plastic pollution this time? Because Norway has been at the forefront of the High Ambition Coalition right from the beginning of this negotiation process. So should we expect any change in the position of the coalition in the fifth INC? How do you see it? Over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, thank you, Tin, and thank you also to CSC for inviting me, and to all the previous speakers for their very insightful and interesting interventions here. I think as a representative of the High Ambition Coalition, which is partly the reason why I'm here, I could start with sharing a few facts about it. So it's together with 66 other countries that we form the High Ambition Coalition to end plastic pollution. And through that, Norway is working to get an effective and ambitious, legally binding treaty. So the coalition was formed actually in August 2022 with then 18 other countries before INC 1 by Norway and Rwanda, which are still co-chairing it. We took the initiative to form a group of ambitious countries to work for a truly effective global treaty that will establish common global rules, turn off the tap, and end plastic pollution by 2040. That was our mission. So, but of course, we all know that it's a long and winding road, and well, the reason this is such a challenge is just looking at the things around me here, surrounding me on my desk, there's hardly a thing that is untouched by plastics or doesn't contain it as an element. So Dr. Sunita referred to is that we had seen it as a wonder substance, and in some sense it still is, because our modern life depends on it. And in some ways, it seems more integrated into every part of everyone's daily life than the carbon emissions that have been discussed in Baku. So, but as useful as it is, excessive use and ineffective waste management means that it is one of the most widespread pollutants on our planet. And so it is a global crisis that requires a global solution. And we believe that the plastic treaty can and should fill this gap and offer better protection to everyone all around the world. But being as it is, it should not be a treaty against plastics as such. They will continue to be an important element in our lives. But production and consumption both production and consumption need to be brought to sustainable levels. So this is a starting point for the hack. We have underlined the scientific evidence of adverse health impacts related to plastics throughout the life cycle, especially for women, infants, and young children, workers and residents of frontline communities exposed to toxic chemicals. We have called for common legally binding global rules and control measures to eliminate and restrict chemicals of environmental or health concern. And all of this is based on scientific evidence. Most waste management systems are already overwhelmed and will not be able to accommodate for the expected growth in production and growth of plastic waste. And the growing carbon emissions from plastic productions are not compatible with achievement of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement. Annual plastics productions is projected to rise from 435 million tons in 2020 to 736 million tons in 2040. So without action, leakage of plastics to the environment will reach 30 million tons in 2040, up from 20 million tons in 2020, amplifying all the negative environmental and health impacts. And the list goes on. And there's chemicals. The scientific community has identified over 16,000 chemicals used in plastics, and over 5,000 have been assessed and deemed harmful. And only under 20% of these are regulated in some form by other international treaties. This leaves over 4,000 hazardous chemicals that is currently found in plastic products, with the risk of negative impacts on the environment and human health. So the reason I'm going into this a little bit, I think it's always useful to remind ourselves of the severity and the actual consequences on the ground that are happening of the problem that are getting lost in brackets and commas, and clear on the importance of binding provisions on production and consumption of plastics. And the need for an explicit link between plastic production and plastic pollution in a treaty was highlighted by many over the course of the talks that happened so far. This could be a global target to be further developed over time, combined with relevant approaches such as on transparency, reporting and monitoring, supply side measures, and alignment with climate targets. In order to avoid more plastic released into the environment, the use of plastic must be limited to products and applications where it is needed, and we must restrict the use of plastic products most likely to end up in the environment. So currently, the situation is such that this is receiving more and more attention from outside of the negotiating community. People all over the world are expecting us to conclude an effective treaty now, and Norway is, and the High Ambition Coalition strongly encourages everybody to contribute to meeting these expectations. It is important that we align in our priorities, and then we will have a better chance of achieving them. But we have a commitment to work with all members to establish and extend areas of common understanding and convergence. And as such, as severe as some of the disagreements, as was shown by the report, are, it's encouraging that the vast majority of INC members are contributing constructively to the negotiations. And so, as was mentioned, the ministers of the High Ambition Coalition, in a ministerial statement just published a few days ago, encourage all INC members to find agreement on goals, as well as on measurable and time-bound targets to ensure that we are on a clear path to end plastic pollution, including on reducing production and consumption of primary plastic polymers to sustainable levels, and on sustainable product design and safe circularity of plastic products, and on sound management of plastic waste. This ministerial statement also stated that it welcomes the call from a broad and diverse range of INC members for global criteria and measures, including for phasing out and restricting certain problematic and avoidable plastic products, as well as for global product design criteria. So now we are not sure, or I'm not sure, how many ministers will be present in Busan. The Norwegian minister in charge of the negotiations will be present towards the end of the meeting, and we are urging other countries that represent the high ambition to be present at the political level at the meeting. But even if the countries' political level are not in sight, we see it as important to follow the negotiations and be available for consultations towards the final hour. The importance of the result is that high, and we see it as crucial to seal a good deal designed to end plastic pollution. Not only because of plastic pollution being a pressing issue that cannot wait, it's also because in a difficult geopolitical situation, we need to show that the multilateral system can tackle all elements of the triple planetary crisis. And so we would be very concerned that failing to finalize the treaty in Busan would diminish the political momentum and the ability to mobilize the continued engagement and financing necessary to continue. So for us, as was just mentioned, the most striking thing about the non-paper is the lack of clarity for the upstream measures on production, chemicals, and products. The paper is much clearer on downstream obligations for waste management and reducing releases into the environment. And we believe if this is to actually become the deal in Busan, it would fail to end plastic pollution. It seems clear that the treaty may not actually give us what we need to end plastic pollution anytime soon. And in that case, it's absolutely necessary that we have a mechanism to ensure strengthening over time, including effective decision-making processes. If not, we will risk having a stagnant or dead treaty that will not be able to adapt to changing future circumstances and developments. And this includes the opportunity for majority decisions going forward. So there are many other specific items to solve, including on means of implementation in general, and which is very important to solve, and on the financial mechanism specifically. And I don't think I have time to go into that. But I would like to underline that there is flexibility from our side to discuss many different solutions to this, including some of those that have been proposed from other sides than from the countries that are part of the High Ambition Coalition. Lastly, on just transition. When transitioning to a safe circular economy, all parties should do so in a way that takes into account the needs of the informal sector, many who now do an important job to collect and recycle plastic waste, and which is not least important here in India, where I'm sitting. And the treaty should also reflect this. So there are so many things to take into account, and we are still hopeful that we can work from the non-paper and try to work for as ambitious an outcome as possible in Busan. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. It gave us a lot of clarity. I can see that most of the questions in the Q&A box have already been answered by Siddharth. But I request Siddharth to quickly check if there is any more questions left. And I can also see Dr. Julius had to leave because of some other commitments. And then we may request Sunita ma'am for her closing remarks. Over to you, Siddharth.
So then there's just one question which Amy is working on. We can move to ma'am.
Ma'am, for your closing remarks, please. Ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Amy, you had a question, so why don't you answer it for everyone, and then I can give my closing remarks.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to be quite brief. And thank you, PE, for the question, which is, there's clearly different camps in negotiations. If all parties refuse to budge, what are the options for moving forward? And I think that the chair has been doing a great job at socializing the non-paper and looking for areas where we can compromise and hold ambition. And so I think that all of us are kind of aware that there are some countries that may be willing to just disrupt the process and delay. And in that situation, we'll either need to continue with more negotiating time in the future or explore other options of how we can work together potentially in the corridors and in bilateral exchanges to understand what a compromise text might look like and create a package of deals that could then be taken and get input from all the other regions. So I think that it's a very real possibility that there will be some delay tactics, but hopefully the countries will use their political will and kind of go on the sidelines and negotiate something that can be usable for the majority. And then we can rely on things like voting to progress in a way forward. So I think there are the options, and PUE happy to sidebar with you in Korea to talk even more in depth about that.
Thank you, Amy. That was a fascinating answer to a very, very complicated question. I mean, that's really at the core of the negotiations. What is going to be the way ahead? But I'm going to take some heart from what Andreas has said, and I think that is really the key as we move ahead. These are two important negotiations for us to fail the world. We are at a tough time. There is no doubt. When we began, I'm old enough to tell you that when we began negotiations on many of the climate and the biodiversity issues in 1992 at Rio, it just seemed much more within grasp because the geopolitics of the world were not so divided, were not so sharp, were not so polarized, were not so divisive. Today we have a different world. But it's a world which we also know that the planetary crises affect us all. Plastics is a classic case. We had really thought that the issue of plastic pollution was a domestic issue, was one that was contained within the nation state. It was something that the nation itself would find the best way to deal with. Till we understood the tentacles of that pollution, till we understood how rampant is the source of the pollution across the globe. And the fact that we needed to come together as nations to find the answer moving forward. And I think that's really what brings countries together to Busan. And I'm absolutely sure that country negotiators understand that even if all negotiations are about give and take, all negotiations are about country positioning. And there is no doubt that countries have positioned themselves, particularly when I look at climate negotiations, and the fossil fuel driven countries have over the years, dismantled, eaten away at the agreements that are there, and whittled away the concept of historical pollution, the concept of equity. And today, the biggest fight in Baku is the means of implementation, because we know that we need that to be able to make the transition in the bulk of the world, which needs to grow, but grow differently. And that's really, I think, the realization of that is what I hope will be there in Busan, that we have to work together, that there is no way that we can divide up the world again into different camps and yet hope to solve this problem as one. And I think that's really what I can see from the non-paper, that there are opportunities there. There is no doubt. We should not move away from the different elements of the convention, which go from upstream to downstream. But it may be very clear that we may not be able to get all the gains we want on upstream, but if we can begin with a very effective deterrence-based convention, plus means of implementation for the downstream, and have the hooks for the upstream so that we can revisit it and tighten it and make it stronger, we can come out of Busan with something that we can work with. And I think that maybe is the way ahead, because the world is changed. It is changing as we speak. And it will change again in January as a new president gets elected in the United States. So it is going to be important for us as a civil society, as people who are absolutely clear that plastic pollution has to go, that plastic pollution is something that we cannot find easy answers to be able to work around. And that's my really last point, that from the history of the climate convention, what is very clear is that it's often not the easy answers that seem easy don't really work. And when I look at the climate conventions, almost every convention has a new buzzword. And every convention looks for a new techno solution, which we hope would solve the problem, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's nature-based solutions, or whether it is something else. And yet we find that we are still back to where we were, which is that emissions are going up and the world is now close to that extremely high danger point of breaching the 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. So that's the lesson we must take to Busan, that we must not, if I can be very sort of careful about this, but underline this, we should not undermine our own ambition. We should not go back on the need for ambition, but we should have the right framing so that we can revisit some of the issues that are contentious and stitch them together as we move ahead on combating what is clearly a problem that we as humans have created and we as humans must learn to solve. It's a wonder substance. It's everywhere in our lives, but it cannot be everywhere in our environment. And that's really what the lesson has to be as we move ahead. So again, thank you very much, Siddharth and Atin, for this work that you do. And thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Amy, for sharing your perspectives with us. And I know that you will all come back from Busan very victorious. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Andreas, there was a question in the Q&A box, which is for you. If you could just take a look and if you would like to respond it, because it may take some time for you to, in fact, answer the question.
What is the question? Can we read
the
Andreas?
question is, Andreas, could you develop more on the financial mechanism? So it's probably a suggestion to the High Emission Coalition that Norway and Rwanda is leading.
Yeah, okay. I could. For your information, I don't see the question, but that doesn't matter. You just read it to me.
Yeah.
It was in the Q&A section, not
yeah, Q&A.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So I just from Norway's side. So on means of implementation generally, the treaty must demand that each party mobilizes resources from all sources, but not all parties can do everything, but everybody kind of must do something. But Norway does not question the considerable need for finance to countries in need, focused in particular on the poorest and most vulnerable, as it's said in the Pact for the Future. We would also very much like to stress that effective control measures for a safe circular economy will reduce plastic waste generation and increase the potential for higher value plastic waste streams that can in turn incentivize investments in collection and recycling infrastructure. So that is something that we think would be also contain a lot of opportunities to work on for developing countries. But without a globally harmonized regulatory landscape for plastic products and chemicals of concern, it's more difficult to see how sufficient financing can be mobilized. So I think that the strength of the agreement will also influence the streams of finance. But on the financial mechanism specifically, we know that there have been different views and different models suggested. So the GEF has an established working relationship with a lot of agencies and has served as a financial mechanism for a long time and collaborates with a myriad of actors. So for us, a new fund, if that is separate from the GEF, we'll have to start on a new path to overcome the narrow mindset. But then sort of to overcome some hindrance. But at the same time, we can see that the new fund would be able to address some of the critical points raised against the GEF. So would we be able to draw from the best of two worlds, the experience and established mechanisms of the GEF, or a potentially more agile additional fund by direct access? We are open to discussing this. And also in order to fund national plastic units, modeled after the successful ozone units under the Montreal Protocol, for example. So that was, well, perhaps a bit messy, but some thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Smita ma'am. Thank you, Amy. Thanks to Dr. Julius, even though he had to leave. Thanks to the entire unit for coming together and producing this report. Thanks, Siddharth. We will be there in Busan, so we'll be reporting how the negotiation process advances on the floor almost day by day basis. And we'll also promise that we'll come back with a debriefing event webinar, either from Busan or as soon as we are back to India, to tell you more about what happened in Busan and what is the way forward. And we hope that you all are going to connect with us again for that discussion. Thank you so much. I mean, it couldn't get any better. It was very insightful. Thank you so much. We hope to see most of you in Busan. Till then, goodbye, take care, and stay safe. Thank you.